You're standing on a floating tower, 4 stories above the water, and you can't even see the lake beneath you, only the roofs of enemy ships far below. In 1363 AD, over 200,000 soldiers met right here, not on an ocean, on a lake. And the fleet that looked unbeatable, red towers tall as buildings, was burned to the waterline in a single day. Not by a bigger fleet, by boats a fraction of the size. Stay with me, because by the end you'll know exactly why height, the very thing that made these ships terrifying, was the same thing quietly killing them. The Chinese called it the Louchuan, the tower ship, a 3 to 4 story fortress that ruled the rivers of China for over 1,500 years, from the Han Dynasty all the way to the early Ming. It wasn't legend. An 11th century AD military manual ranked it as the single most powerful warship in the Empire's entire navy. So let's start where every good story about a giant starts, with the wood, the glue, and the strange trade-off that made this fortress possible in the first place. "2,000 years ago, shipwrights faced a brutal engineering tension. They needed to carry hundreds of armoured soldiers, siege weapons, and multiple decks of timber down rivers that were shallow, narrow, and full of shifting sandbars. Build too heavy, and you run aground. Build too light, and the ship tears itself apart when a sideways current hits the hull. Everything about the Louchuan was an answer to that constraint. The design prioritized flexibility over rigidity. Instead of iron nails, shipwrights joined planks of Chinese fir and elm, using mortise and tenon joints, locked with wooden dowels. Think of it like a woven basket rather than a rigid wooden crate. A basket flexes under pressure, whereas a rigid box simply cracks. When twisting river currents pushed against the hull, iron fasteners would have sheared apart under the strain. The wooden joints flexed instead, absorbing kinetic energy and moving with the current. To seal the gaps between planks, builders used a compound called chu-nam, tung oil, lime, and hemp fibre, worked together into a paste. It cured into something tough, but still slightly elastic, so it kept its watertight seal even as the hull flexed underneath it. Inside the hull, builders added transverse bulkheads, sealed compartments that turned one long, open hold into a row of separate rooms. If an enemy ram punched a hole in one compartment, that section flooded. The rest of the ship stayed dry and afloat. And here's the part that should stop you for a second. That watertight compartment idea, the one solving a wood and river problem 2,000 years ago, is the exact same principle sitting inside every submarine, oil tanker, and cargo ship on Earth right now. We didn't invent it, we just built it out of steel. But a single ship, no matter how well built, never won a river war alone. The Louchuan only worked as part of something bigger. Why did an empire need 6 different kinds of warships instead of just building more giants? Because a fleet of nothing but Louchuan would have been powerful and completely blind. Look at the blueprint for how this navy actually moved. An 11th century military compendium called the Wujing Zongyao reveals that the Louchuan sat at the top of a strict 6-tier hierarchy. Beneath it were the Duxian, heavy armoured junks for direct boarding, the Mengchong, fast assault craft sheeted in thick leather, the Zhuge, narrow speed scouts, the Youliang, shallow water recon boats, and the Haihu, aggressors built to hunt down light craft. Think about what that meant on the water. The Louchuan never had to scout ahead or navigate shallow mudflats. The Zhuge and Youliang did that work, feeding information back to the fortress. The Mengchong and Duxian absorbed the close quarters fighting, protecting the flagship's vulnerable hull from smaller, faster attackers. The tower ship was the brain and the heavy gun. Everything else was the nervous system keeping it alive. The proof this wasn't improvised is the compendium itself, a formal military classification written by court strategist Zheng Gongliang, treating naval warfare the way a modern general treats combined arms: infantry, armour, and reconnaissance, each doing one job. Here's the belief worth breaking. We picture ancient naval power as one giant ship facing another giant ship. In reality, the Louchuan was never meant to fight alone, and the moment it did, in 1363 AD. That missing support system became the difference between survival and disaster. That six-tier system explains how the Louchuan was supposed to be protected. It says nothing about how big the tower ship itself could actually get. And that number is where ancient record keepers may have wildly exaggerated the truth. Ancient record keepers leave us with a major engineering contradiction. Tang and Jin dynasty records claim Admiral Wang Jun built a flagship 200 paces long, roughly 1,000 feet. If taken literally, that describes a wooden hull longer than 3 football fields, built 1,000 years before structural steel reinforcement existed. This claim matters because it tests the absolute physical limits of ancient naval architecture, or reveals how imperial courts used exaggeration to project power. Here's what the physics actually says. Wooden hulls have a hard ceiling. Push a wooden ship past roughly 300 to 350 feet, and the natural flex of timber starts working against itself. As the hull rides over waves, the ends and the middle take turns bearing the load, a stress called hogging and sagging. Planks begin sliding against each other. The caulked seams tear open, and the hull literally pulls itself apart from the inside. Here's the proof by comparison. Even the largest wooden warships Europe ever built, nearly 2,000 years later, topped out far short of that 1,000-foot claim. The French ship of the line Bretagne, one of the biggest wooden warships in history, measured 266 feet, a quarter of what Wang Jun supposedly commanded. So what actually happened? Most likely, that 1,000-foot number was either court exaggeration designed to inflate the emperor's prestige, or it described something else entirely. A temporary catamaran platform, multiple hulls lashed together for a single river crossing, not one continuous rigid ship. Here's the aha moment. The most impressive engineering claim about the Louchuan is probably the one part of the story that isn't literally true. And the real engineering, the mortise and tenon joints, the flexible hull, the six-tier fleet, was already impressive enough without the exaggeration. Whatever their true size, these ships still had to survive on the water using nothing but wood, wind, and human strength. And the physics of staying upright turned out to be a far more dangerous enemy than any rival fleet. The feature that made the Louchuan visually terrifying, its height, was working against it every hour it sat on the water. Hydrodynamics relies on the relationship between two forces, the center of buoyancy beneath the waterline and the center of gravity stacked above it. Keep the center of gravity low and the ship rights itself smoothly after a wave or gust of wind. Push the center of gravity too high and the margin for correction collapses. On the Louchuan, this physics problem was built directly into the blueprint. To navigate shallow rivers, the hull was flat and sat just 1 to 2 meters deep in the water. That kept the floating point low, which was good, but then shipwrights added 3 or 4 full decks on top of that shallow hull, plus towers reaching 7 meters into the air, plus trebuchets, armor, and hundreds of soldiers. All of that weight sat far above the water. The gap between stable and tipping over got razor thin. Picture someone standing on a surfboard with a heavy backpack held straight over their head. On flat water, they can stand there all day and look completely in control. One sideways push though, and there's nothing left to correct the fall. That's the Louchuan on open water. On a calm river, it looked unshakable. Tang Dynasty military records openly warned that in rough seas these same ships would slip out of human control entirely, which is exactly why they were kept close to rivers, lakes, and calm coastal water, never sent into the open ocean. Here's the moment worth sitting with. We tend to assume the tallest, most heavily armoured ship is automatically the strongest one in the fight. The physics says the opposite. The taller these ships were built, the closer every one of them sailed to the edge of tipping over, and all it would take was one wrong gust of wind. A fragile giant like this could only survive one way, by making sure no enemy ever got close enough to matter. So the deck of a Louchuan carried some of the most frightening weapons of the ancient world. Why load a ship this unstable with heavy weapons at all? Because if you can't afford to get hit, your only option is to make sure nothing ever reaches you in the first place. Every weapon on board existed to keep the fight at a distance. Step onto the deck and the entire layout reveals one objective: keep the enemy at a distance. On top, traction trebuchets launch stones, clay incendiary bombs, and containers of molten iron, smelted directly on board and hurled liquid to melt enemy rigging. The middle decks housed heavy swivel crossbows, firing iron-tipped bolts that punched straight through wooden hulls. Deep at the bottom, isolated from the fire, up to 200 rowers kept the fortress moving. But the most destructive weapon on board didn't use gunpowder, arrows, or fire. Along the side, a 50-foot timber boom with a heavy iron-spiked head hung from a crane-like mast. This was the Poyang, the striking beam. When an enemy boat closed in for a boarding attempt, the crew simply cut the retaining rope. Gravity did the rest, driving that spiked timber straight down through the enemy's deck like a nail through a plank. The proof this worked comes from the Sui dynasty, which deployed the Poyang with devastating effect along the Yangtze River between 588 and 589 AD, using it to crush enemy hulls before they ever got close enough to board. We picture ancient naval combat as swords and boarding parties. The Louchuan was built to make sure that scene never happened. It was a standoff artillery platform first, designed to destroy an enemy from range, long before anyone climbed a rope. For centuries, this combination of height, armour and range made the Louchuan look completely unbeatable. And in 1363 AD, one warlord staked an entire empire on that belief. Why does one man's decision matter this much to the story? Because Chen Youliang didn't just build tower ships. He built the biggest version of them anyone had ever seen, and he trusted that size alone would win the war. Historical accounts describe a fleet of over 100 giant Louchuan painted deep red, with multi-tiered towers rising up to 5 stories above the waterline. Each flagship carried hundreds of soldiers, siege engines, and horses. The hanging galleries were wide enough for mounted messengers, and soldiers on the upper deck stood far above the river surface. Chen sailed this floating city down toward the strategically vital town of Nanchang, confident that nothing on the water could stand against him. Here's how the odds looked on paper. His rival, Zhu Yuanzhang, the future founder of the Ming dynasty, arrived with a fleet roughly a third the size in manpower, built almost entirely from small, flat-bottomed river junks. To anyone watching from shore, it looked like a mismatch settled before the first arrow was fired, a floating city against a swarm of rowboats. The proof of Chen's confidence is right there in the plan itself. He wasn't preparing for a long, cautious siege. He was preparing to use these ships as mobile fortresses, tall enough to scale city walls directly from the water. We assume the side with the bigger, better armed fleet has already won before the fighting starts. Chen's fleet was the strongest force on the water. It was also about to run headfirst into the one thing no amount of size could outbuild, the lake itself and the season it was about to become. Because as summer faded into autumn, the water beneath those giant hulls began to quietly disappear. Why did the most powerful fleet in the world lose without ever losing a real ship-to-ship battle? Because the thing that defeated it wasn't a weapon, it was the calendar. To understand why this fleet collapsed, you have to look beneath the hulls. Lake Poyang is a seasonal wetland connected to the Yangtze River. It swells across thousands of square kilometers in summer, but as autumn arrives, the water drops rapidly, exposing hidden mudflats and narrow channels. Through August and September of 1363 AD, Chen's heavy Louchuan began slamming into sandbars that hadn't existed weeks earlier, while Zhu's light, shallow junks glided right past them. Then Chen made the fatal engineering trade-off. To stop his grounded, top-heavy fortresses from rolling in the narrow channels, he ordered over 100 ships chained together into one solid line. It solved the wobble immediately. It also turned over 100 separate ships into a single connected mass that could not scatter, could not retreat, and could not put distance between itself and a fire. Guided by strategists Jiao Yu and Liu Bowen, Zhu Yuanzhang answered with technology from the Huo Long Jing, the Fire Dragon Manual. His crews built a weapon called the Wunaihe, the No Alternative, a 7-foot cylinder of reed matting wrapped in red paper and hemp cord, packed with low nitrate gunpowder, lead shot, and small incendiary charges. Small junks manoeuvred close to the towering hulls, lit the fuse, and swung the device directly onto the crowded decks above. On August 31st, a sudden shift in the wind carried a wave of unmanned fire rafts straight into the chained Han fleet. The fire spread from ship to ship, with nothing to stop it, because there was nowhere for any single ship to go. Here's the number that says everything. Over 100 connected fortresses became one uninterrupted fire stretching for miles across the water. By October 4th, after weeks trapped in the shrinking lake, Chen Youliang was killed by a stray arrow during a final desperate attempt to break out. Here's the part worth remembering. Chaining those ships together wasn't a foolish decision. It was the logical engineering answer to a real, immediate stability problem. The darker lesson is this: the solution that solves today's crisis is sometimes exactly what removes your ability to survive tomorrow's. That firestorm sealed the fate of an empire, but it also sounds strangely familiar, and that similarity has historians arguing to this day. Here's something that should bother you a little. This isn't the first time a story like this appears in Chinese history. 1100 years earlier, in 208 AD, the Battle of Red Cliffs followed almost the exact same script: a massive northern fleet with towering, heavily fortified ships. That commander chaining his vessels together to solve a stability problem. A smaller southern force using fast ships and fire to destroy them. And a sudden, convenient shift in the wind arriving at exactly the right moment. Why does that matter? Because when the same 4 plot points repeat themselves 11 centuries apart, you have to ask whether you're reading history or reading a legend that got recycled. Split the historians down the middle, and 2 explanations emerge. On one side, scholars argue that Ming court writers deliberately embellished the account to match Red Cliffs, creating a legendary story to legitimize Zhu Yuanzhang's rise to power. On the other side, naval architects look at the raw hydrodynamics. Chaining top-heavy ships together was simply the most logical engineering fix for hull stability available in the 14th century. If 2 different commanders, 1100 years apart, face the same hydrostatic problem, it's entirely plausible both of them reached for the same solution and both paid the same price for it. Here's the honest answer. We may never fully separate the engineering truth from the storytelling, but that uncertainty is part of what makes this history worth studying closely instead of taking at face value. What's certain is what happened after the smoke cleared and how completely it reshaped the future of naval warfare in China. Why does any of this matter outside of a history lesson? Because the Louchuan didn't really lose to fire. It lost to an idea, and that idea is still built into the systems we depend on every day. Look at where the design failed, and the flaw becomes obvious. Concentrating an entire army into a few massive platforms creates a false sense of invulnerability. Chen's fleet had unmatched firepower, but because that power was centralized, a single shifting wind and a localized fire wiped out the entire force in hours. Zhu's fleet, by contrast, operated like a distributed network rather than a single beam. Cut one thread and the web holds. Lose one small junk and the rest of the fleet keeps functioning exactly as before, because nothing depends on any single piece surviving. That's the same logic hiding inside a modern power grid or a municipal water system. Enormous, efficient, centralized, and one bad localized failure away from a cascade that reaches everyone downstream. Chen's refusal to abandon his enormous, expensive ships, even as the falling water made them useless, is the same instinct that keeps people and organizations pouring more resources into one rigid system long after the conditions around it have changed. Here's the belief worth breaking, and it's the biggest one in this whole story. We assume big and centralized automatically means safe and strong. Lake Poyang says otherwise. Concentrated complexity is often a fragile illusion, and real resilience comes from many small, independent parts that can fail without taking the rest down with them. Which brings us back to that burning lake, and the one question it still leaves for anyone building anything meant to last. The Louchuan was the finest expression of ancient engineering ambition on the water, a floating fortress that ruled China's rivers for well over 1,000 years, protected by a whole fleet built specifically to keep it alive, undone in the end not by a bigger fortress, but by shallow water, a shifting wind, and small boats built to bend instead of break. Every light switch you flip and every tap you turn trusts a system built on the same logic those chain tower ships once relied on: powerful, efficient, and one localized failure away from a very bad day. If stories like this one, where ancient engineering explains the world you're actually living in right now, are the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe to Silk Road Diaries. There's an entire empire's worth of these stories still waiting on the water.